Oh man, I've had a week this week. It started on Thursday. I was going on a run, and this big old snake jumped out right in front of me as I was running. I'm going to share that story for another time in a sermon illustration for taming the tongue. On Friday, I decided to replace old faucets in the master bathroom. And as I was beneath the faucet and turning the water valve to off to begin work on one of the last valves, as I was turning off, it was made of plastic. Good thing the water was off, but the plastic valve snapped off. And I said, okay, I'm going to go ahead and use some Gorilla super glue to put the plastic valve back on so then I could turn the water back on. So I went down to the garage, grabbed the Gorilla super glue, put the valve back on, and needed two hands, so I put the super glue off to the side. And so then I said, well, now that the valve is back, I'm going to let it dry, so I might as well go ahead and get to work on replacing the faucet. So I went below the sink and started working on the water lines to unhook them to replace the old faucet for a new faucet. Well, I needed a tool that I forgot to grab, so I tried to lift my head to grab the tool, and my head was stuck. I couldn't move. And at that moment, I realized that as I was trying to replace and take the water line, that my head was swimming in Gorilla super glue. So I had a decision to make. My wife was gone, my kids were in school, and so I counted to 3, had a deep breath, and yanked. I was free, but a wad of hair was not. So that's this. I don't know what's more embarrassing, you laughing or one of my children, I won't name who, said, "Dad, have you thought maybe about staying in the house for a couple weeks?" Laughing with you, thanks. Yeah. So guests and members, thank you for being here where the preacher is not perfect and often makes mistakes. J.R.R. Tolkien has this quote where he says, "Not all those who wander are lost." I like the premise of this quote. Life is a journey. It's filled with expectations, failures, surprises, and regardless, we press on. In fact, being a disciple of Jesus is an action of wandering. The book of Luke is a gospel that invites us to walk beside Jesus, and I would even consider it the wandering gospel. Immediately in Luke chapter 5, Jesus calls his disciples to follow him, and then he takes his disciples and the audience reading the story on this incredible journey. Traveling from towns, Jesus stops to teach, heal, and even dine with sinners. We find Jesus walking through grain fields and entering into synagogues and sitting on top of mountains. He stops in familiar towns like Capernaum, unfamiliar towns like Nain, going through the valley of Gerasenes, calming storms in the Sea of Galilee. In Luke 8, verses 1, it says, "After this, Jesus traveled about from one town and one village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God." Discipleship is a journey, a lifelong endeavor. And so first I want to make this important point, that no matter where you are in your life, there is no need to feel like you have completely failed. See, Jesus is ready, no matter where you are, to take some steps with you, to walk with you. In Luke chapter 9, verses 51, and if you want to turn there with me, What seems like after a while, where Jesus is kind of going from one place to another place, there's this shift in the story, this intentional move where Jesus becomes more determined. It's no longer going here and there, but now he's focused. And the verse says, when the days draw near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. There's this certain determination in Jesus' step. He's focused. It's time, he's saying, to get serious with this kingdom of God thing. You see, it would be easy for us to overlook this simple passage, but from this point on, all the way until Luke 19, verses 28, that's almost 10 chapters, Luke invites his readers to see what it really looks like to walk beside Jesus. And so it's almost as if Luke is saying, it's time now. It's time for you. It's time for you now to make your own determined decision on whether or not you are truly going to follow Jesus Christ. And so this morning, I want us to walk with Jesus in Luke 9, 51 through 62. And I want to look at some practical ways that can help us along our own wandering faith journey. You see, once Jesus sets his eyes on Jerusalem, he decides to send some people ahead of him into this neighboring town to kind of set things up. And immediately we're drawn to reality, and this is the reality, that he will be rejected. Jesus and his disciples, they go to this Samaritan town, is what the text says. And if you know a little bit about the history between the Jews and the Samaritans, you know that it's a horrible relationship that has happened ever since the destruction of northern Israel back in the time of 721 BC when the Assyrians came and attacked. You see, many of the Samaritans were considered northern left-behind Jews after the destruction of Israel and after many of God's people were enslaved and sent off. So these two religious communities, there's some similarities, but there's some vast differences. And because of these vast differences, there's hostility between the both of them. In a sense, the feeling is mutual. And so the village here was almost saying to Jesus, the Messiah, and to the disciples, you are not welcomed here. And here Jesus has a teachable moment. How should Jesus respond to this rejection? How should he talk to this village of Samaritans who've just rejected him? I mean, how would you respond to rejection? Defensive? Anger? Judgmental? And so, ironically, James and John and Peter respond in a different way, or James and John do. They respond by saying what? Let's bring fire down upon these Samaritans. Earlier in chapter 9, James and John and Peter, that's why I was bringing it up earlier, go to this mountain where Moses and Elijah appear. And we called this story the Transfiguration. And so they've just had this great encounter with Elijah and Moses. And if you know the stories of Moses and Elijah, both of them have the voice, the commandment to speak to God. And in one of those, they have this really cool weapon they can use. They both can actually invite God to rain fire down. In fact, that was one of the options when God's people messed up at Mount Sinai, but God didn't rain fire down there. But God did rain fire down when Elijah asked him during the prophets of Baal story, and God brought fire down and destroyed this altar. And so, of course, James and Peter and John are like, man, if we're hanging out with the likes of Elijah and Moses, and even these guys are following our close bud Jesus, why not? Why can't we, right at our fingertips, have the power to rain fire down on those people that are hostile towards us? I mean, isn't that the appropriate response when people are against you? When they're against your faith? When they don't think the way you think? When they reject your lifestyle? Isn't the most appropriate response to rain fire down? Isn't that the hard spoken truth? And the irony is, Jesus doesn't let them rain fire down. In fact, he doesn't even speak to the village of the Samaritans. He uses this opportunity to rebuke his own disciples. And when the disciples, in verse 54 says, when James and John saw it, they said, Lord, do you want us to tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them? But he turned, it says in verse 55, and he rebuked them for even thinking such a thing. The best offense in Christianity is grace, mercy, and forgiveness. That is the best offense. You see, Jesus is looking at his disciples and at us, and he says, look, the Son of Man came to be rejected. That's the mission. That's the story. And the best response when being rejected is to offer mercy and forgiveness. Discipleship requires a new shaped heart built upon the qualities of the cross. And if you look at the cross even briefly, you know the cross speaks of forgiveness. It speaks of sacrifice. It speaks of being meek. It speaks of being merciful. It speaks of being gentle. And so once you take additional steps in your walk with Jesus, I don't even think this is prophetic, but I'm going to guarantee it, that your next steps with Jesus could result in some form of rejection. And we can't walk around cynical, unhappy. We can't walk around lacking forgiveness. We can't walk around. For all the sin and pain in this world, Jesus did not bring fire. And so the next steps in your walk with faith this morning, I want to encourage you to forgive a little, to be a little gentle. Forgive others. Forgive yourself. Let's think about it. Just take a pause for just a moment, and in your own life, look back at some of the most mature Christians and disciples in your own life. One of the most important qualities is that this person, think about it, was gentle. They just had this easy, gentle spirit about them. In fact, I would place gentleness way higher as one of the most important qualities of a leader than being driven, dynamic, or bold. Let's not take ourselves so seriously, right? It's okay, to be gentle, to be easygoing, to be forgiving. I think that's what Christ is calling us. It's not that hard. And this week, if you find yourself being impatient, if you find yourself getting mad, if you find yourself getting angry this week, just think about my new haircut. Immediately following Jesus' rebuking, Jesus gives some more very practical advice. And this is what he's going to say. This is what it takes to follow me. And so the rest of the section, I want to look at what discipleship is and how discipleship is not, I wish it was, but it's not a candy-coated, comfortable experience. One of the statements made right away after Jesus rebukes the disciples is this idea about foxes have their holes and birds have their nests. This statement first begins with, I will follow you wherever you go. And this is a statement of what? It's a statement of willingness. And I want to follow the path, Jesus, where you're heading. And there's nothing wrong with this statement. But Jesus is a Savior, and he has this mission in mind. And his mission in his mind is to not create a mission where the places where you rest your head and the residences of where you are and the areas that consume you most, he doesn't want to make these places absolutely comfortable for you. That's not his mission. His mission in the world and the cross and resurrection isn't just to make your beds more comfortable and your pillows more fluffy and your homes better for you. He has something way better in mind. Foxes have holes, birds have nests, People have homes. But that's not Jesus' interest. Luke 4, Jesus' mission is this, that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives, recovering sight to the blind. He has set liberty to those who have been oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. It's almost as if Jesus is saying in that story with the rich young ruler, discipleship asks you to disregard comfort and a high standard of living and disregard those as virtues of faith. Now, he's not telling you to disregard them altogether. He's just asking you to remember that those aren't number one as Christian. The next two verses Jesus does is related to family and tradition, right? Burying the dead and saying goodbye to family. And not only are these reasonable requests, but these are societal obligations. But here's the point. Jesus is willing to challenge normal expectations and obligations. He is unafraid to challenge what we think is normal. You see, Jesus is establishing a new criteria, a new normal, and how we manage our priorities. Let me say it this way. You've heard this said, right? You've heard us, and we say this all the time, and I even say this sometimes, but we categorize life, right? So I may come up and say, look, God or church is first. Family is, am I the only one who's heard this? Second, right? Jobs are third, or, and so you start making this list, and you categorize what's important. Jesus is asking us to stop doing that, and this is why. If you categorize God as one and work as maybe number 4 or 5, there is a long enough gap where you might be tempted where God does not have to be introduced into your workplace. Make sense? Because there's a gap there. That's number 4, that's number 1. Why mess with that? So this is what Jesus is saying. Number 1, God. Number 2, God. Number 3, God. Number 4, God. Great answer. And how do I know this? Because Jesus is saying, hey, look, set the plow and go straight forward and look and focus. And that focus is on your walk in faith with Jesus. Incredibly, this is what happens. Here is the irony if this is what you do in your life. Jesus then becomes centered in your family. Jesus then becomes centered in your workplace. Jesus then becomes centered in your activities and your hobbies and all the things in your life that consume you, the things that take the most time in your life. If you prioritize everything around Jesus, then all those other things will also be centered on Jesus. So no longer do you have to worry about work being 4, because work is completely integrated into your faith in the disciple of Jesus Christ. In fact, the next couple weeks in our sermon series, we're going to look at some of these areas and identify how can I be Jesus at work? Or how can I be Jesus in my family? How can I be Jesus at school or in other areas of life? Growing up, one of the chores I had to do was mowing my yard. And my dad had this saying related to cutting grass. And I'm going to try to do my best dad voice. It doesn't work. I'm not taken seriously sometimes as a dad. All right. If you didn't do it right the first time, then it's like you didn't do it at all. Okay, so that was one of my dad's sayings for yard work. And essentially what he said was, if you didn't do it right the first time, redo it. Sounds rough, I know, but he's a great dad. I was just a very bad kid. So I only had to start over a few times to make sure I got the job done the first time, right? So, and this is what I mean by cutting grass. And you might know this. So if you mess up one line, especially early on cutting grass, then all of a sudden when you take a step back and you look at your yard, what do your lines look like? it looks horrible, right? I mean, it's really embarrassing, and there's lines every which way. You see these pockets of grass growing, and you just, I don't know. I don't know what you do, but it makes me upset. Okay, so what my dad is essentially saying is, from the very beginning of time, from the very beginning, that moment when you first start cutting grass, just stay focused and cut that line, keep going straight, don't stop, trust that line, go through and just keep going, trust that line, keep going straight. Now, if you get all, and if you anticipate how good it looks or getting all excited, wait to the very end, then step back and look at how beautiful and wonderful it is. But until then, stay focused, drive, and pursue what you're doing. That's what Jesus is saying about this plow. He wants you to be intent in all aspects of your life. Jesus is not saying skip important funerals. He's not saying sell your home. He's challenging the area of lives that consume us the most. Jobs and schools. He's asking how we set our hearts and our minds. How have we set Jesus in the areas? How have we made Jesus the priority? And so this week, I encourage you, how can you be focused on Christ this week at school? How can you be focused on Christ in your relationships with your spouse or with your friends? How can you be focused on Christ in your relationship with this church family? In the coming weeks, I want us to look at these very specific areas. So I want you to pray about what it means to be a life of disciple. What are your next steps? If you're married, what does it mean to be a discipled spouse? If you are an employee or employer, what does it mean to be a disciple in your workplace? Even if you're consumed with various school functions and activities and going to school and getting your education, what does it mean, even in the midst of your 8 o'clock class, to be a disciple of Jesus Christ? How are we being a disciple? People are now realizing who Jesus is at the point of Luke, and so everybody is saying, I want to follow you. I want to follow you. Wherever you go, Jesus, I'm going to follow you. Let me follow you, Jesus. Let me follow you. There's this deep desire to pursue the likeness of Christ. So the question for us is, are you ready for the next steps? Are you ready to practice some forgiveness? Are you ready to be gentle and to be determined and set your life and your priorities on Jesus?